You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my dad, Jake Reckward. We're doing this for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek and Next Generation fans out there that we're putting all these shows and episodes out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you?
I'm doing really well. I think that we're in for a pretty good conversation about tonight's episode. We're reviewing Star Trek The Next Generation, Season 3, Episode 12. It's kind of crazy to think that we're already halfway through. But the episode we're reviewing is The High Ground, which debuted on January 29th, 1989, but has an in-world star date of 43510.7. I think in many ways this is another example of how the episodes of season 3 have gotten very tight and very focused in terms of their narrative content. And for the most part, these are much better acted, much more what's the word I'm looking for here? I think that they're better narrated shows. For the most part, like there's just a consistent line of storytelling that they rarely break from, where in season 1 and in parts of season 2, like sometimes those episodes were all over the place.
Would focus be a good word?
I think focus would be a good word. My only problem with this episode is that in 1989, I think in some ways I understand the ending, but in 2021 I had some problems with it. But we'll get into that.
Yeah.
What did you think of the episode just in general, without giving away anything of the story before we launch into it?
I thought it was, as you said, very tight and well focused. I think it will have some interesting things to discuss about it in relationship to some of the statements that were made about terrorism and when that might be justified, or is it ever justified?
Right. Well, I think one thing that we'll also get into, in connection to the discussion of terrorism, is kind of the world political stage in 1989, which I think you could speak to better than I. Versus, I think, our perceptions of that world now in 2021 and what the world kind of looks like. Specifically, I kind of want to talk about Israel and Palestine tonight, and I know that can be a very sensitive subject, but I think this episode hits on a lot of those things, especially some things from my childhood memory that I didn't realize until we were really sitting down to work on this episode. But just to get the folks at home listening started, the Enterprise D has gone to Rutia 4 to deliver medical supply. Sorry, I should probably take a sip of this drink before I continue. That will probably sound awful recorded, but anyway. The Enterprise D has put in at Rutia 4 to deliver medical supplies following an outbreak of violent protest. Although the planet of Rutia 4 is non-aligned, the planet has enjoyed a long trading economic relationship with the Federation. Now a generation of peace has ended with terrorist attacks by Insada separatists demanding autonomy and self-determination for their homeland on the western continent. because it seems like Rutia 4 is ruled by a government on the eastern continent, but it's like a global government. Um, when we open the episode, Lieutenant Commander Data, Lieutenant Worf, and Dr. Beverly Crusher on the surface having lunch in the plaza of the city after recreational shore leave has been prohibited, and all the away teams have been instructed to beam down armed. As Dr. Beverly Crusher calls for the waiter, a bomb explodes, injuring several bystanders. Crusher rushes over to help the wounded, while Worf tries to provide security for her. There's a little back and forth between Data, Captain Picard, and Riker over who's going to try to get Beverly Crusher to actually go back up on the Enterprise and follow her orders instead of, being the badass doctor she is. Um, I wanted to, let's stop and talk about Beverly Crusher here for a second. Um, I think since her return from, the exodus that Gates McFadden had in season 2, I think that this character, for the most part, has been very strong, and every time that they've portrayed her, she's taken a major role in a lot of the narratives. It's very odd to think that just a season ago we were dealing with Dr. Catherine Pulaski. Like, as someone who's watching the show now, do you even remember? I think I have a weird question to ask this way, but do you miss Pulaski at this point? And what do you think of Dr. Crusher so far now that the character has returned at this point in the season?
I think you bring up a good point because, after season one or during season one, she became an established character. So it was a little
Yes,
bit of a surprise when she's not in season two and Dr. Pulaski shows up. And,
correct.
we kind of talked about her at times when we were reviewing episodes of season two. That's, she did, what was her name? What was the actress's name? Uh,
Diane
Mal,
Mola?
Mal, Maldauer or something like that. But
Yeah,
she was a good actor, and but she never really, we felt like she never really fit in, the way they wrote her character, the way she portrayed it. So I think now
Diana
that,
Moldauer. Yeah.
yeah, when Dr. Crusher and Gates McFadden is back in season three, it's almost like she's just fit back in,
Hmm.
that it was almost like Dr. Pulaski was a bump, and she's
Right.
not really missed. And I agree with you that the way they're writing for the Beverly Crusher character, she's really strong. Yes.
Well, even you just made a point that, like, Dr. Pulaski isn't even missed. The opening storyline that they had with Dr. Crusher was that she was having a hard time readjusting back to the Enterprise with, like, Wesley taking on more adult responsibilities, and of course she's been away from him for a year. They really haven't dealt with that storyline at all
Not
since the
much,
beginning of
no.
the season.
Right.
But I think for the most part she serves as a good. I think that we often forget that as a doctor in Starfleet, she basically has a commander status and can take, you know, can take command of the ship and has the ability to relieve the captain of his duties if she thinks that he's medically compromised. So there is a lot of power that they give to this character, but I think one of the things they do in writing her is that they make her on a good equal level with Jean-Luc Picard. And I think that this is one of those scenes where, like, Riker kind of looks at Picard like, I don't want to be in the transporter room when she comes up. I
Right.
think that that's a good scene where it really talks about, like, kind of the intrinsic value she has and just not only the respect that she has with the crew, but there's also an understanding, like, this character is doing her duty. And And I think the question I'm going to get to you, would you have beamed her up? Because Jean-Luc Picard leaves her down there, which, ultimately creates the risk of her being captured. But would you have beamed her up?
I think I would. Yes.
Okay. You would have
Yeah.
gone to the transporter room and gotten chewed out?
I would have gone to the transporter room and got chewed out. Yes.
Yeah, I think I would too. I mean, I think ultimately the one of the bigger cruxes of the story that this will get to, and following up on where we are. So once Beverly Crusher is kidnapped, she's taken underground by the Asada resistance, well, rebels, and is met by their leader named Kirill Finn. Um, Beverly initially does not provide the name, rank, or serial number that most Starfleet officers, and I think most of our military officers, if they're captured today, are supposed. Those are the only things they're supposed to divulge. Correct?
Right. As far as I know, still, yes.
Okay, and that's so like if there are diplomatic. If there are diplomatic communiques between two opposing forces, like that's supposed to help people with like hostage negotiation, correct? And just say like I'm alive. Please tell
Right.
people I'm alive. Here's my
Right.
number.
Right.
Okay. Is that I don't know if you would know this, but has that ever really been effective in terms of like getting people back and forth out of hostile places?
Well, I think that there's
Because it's used a lot in fiction for a lot of different things.
well during World
But I
War
don't I don't
II.
know about its real world
I
application.
mean, during World War II, I think that there was some following of some Geneva Convention rules where POWs they would have to be reported to the International Red Cross, and that information would go
Okay.
between different sides. Not that there were really any prisoner exchanges, during then, but that's way. If someone, I'm reading a book right now about a downed flyer
Mm.
after the Normandy invasion, and he had his plane was shot down. He was captured by the Germans, and the information did get back to his family. I don't know what the time frame was that he was reported as a prisoner of war, so that the family knew he was alive still.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. But okay, thank you. What's that book called, by the way? Or do you know it off the top of your head?
I think it's Lightning Down. It's a relatively new book about a guy named Joe Moser who really loved airplanes and became a P-38 pilot. And he was shot down. It just tells his story of survival from August of 1944 until the end of the war in Europe. He ended up uh, being put in Buchenwald concentration camp
Oh wow.
because
Okay.
the Germans, because of the somewhat bombing of civilians, the
Mm-hmm.
Germans uh, at that time in the war referred to American flyers as terror fleeters, terror
Mm-hmm.
flyers. So they felt that they were by you know um, intentionally or unintentionally bombing civilian targets that they were committing terrorist acts, which always
Wow.
goes back to
Huh.
the whole thing of the terror. That the Germans bombed London, and then the British started
Right.
bombing the cities, and we joined them in. We firebombed Dresden and Hamburg, and this guy's going on a train through Frankfurt in 1944, and it's just like the city's totally destroyed.
Well, like you brought up Dresden. World War II has all of these horrific bombings that and this is kind of a morbid thing to talk about, but you can measure like the wave of total destruction by like there's Hiroshima and Nagasaki that were hit by their bombs. So like the effect of like a nuclear weapon was seen there. But Dresden to me is probably one of the most horrific things you've ever seen in a war. I mean, just for reference for Ben and people listening at home, it was it was Americans, right? Were we the ones firebombing Dresden? Was it British and
I'm pretty sure it was the British.
okay, but the
Yeah,
British basically firebombed Dresden, and the the fact that that thing was just not like disintegrated off the face of the earth and the entire place wasn't burnt smooth is pretty impressive. Like it, one of the most horrific war scenes you can
yeah,
imagine.
right.
There are pictures still of the internet of like bodies being piled in places in Dresden, and just like the amount of destruction is pretty intense. There's, in fact, I don't know if you've seen these, Dad. There's pictures of Dresden right after the bombings and Dresden today, kind of interposed over each other, and like it's so different from so
Oh,
many other
sure,
different cities that were
sure.
struck during World War
Right,
II.
right.
London is surprisingly different too. Um, but anyway, getting to the main crux of the story, I think this gets to one of the first questions you asked. So Kirill Finn is the Asada leader and introduces himself to Beverly Crusher, who does not provide initially her name, rank, or serial number. She initially opens up to him after she brings him food, and he reveals to her that he needs a doctor because the quote unquote transportation technology that they use to kidnap Beverly Crusher is actually a dimensional shift transport technology that is harmful to humanoid tissue. And by kidnapping Dr. Crusher, these Insada rebels think that they will be able to help provide the needed medical assistance to basically save their very small group of terrorists, um, or rebels, depending on how you look at this. But this leads to, I think, one of the first questions that you had. What is the Enterprise and Federation's role here in all this? Um, you and I have been going back and forth about the various roles that the Federation sends the Enterprise on, and this one seems to be um, a routine medical supply to a government that is under hostile threat that these people are suddenly dragged into, which is, the writer's conceit of the conversation. If no one's captured, you don't have a story. If there's no kidnapping, we don't have an
Right,
episode.
exactly.
So putting that aside and the suspension of disbelief, um, it's said in the opener that Rutia 4 is a planet that is a non-member but aligned with the Federation through a successful economic trade agreement, it seems. So, you know, I read Ben and I are watching the show every day, and we're watching different parts of the show. But every time TNG comes on, and Ben, if you listen to this later, to help you read Ben, I started like reading the names of the actors who play certain characters, like Patrick Stewart stars as Captain Jean-Luc Picard, blah blah blah. But I also read like the actual opener, to explore strange new worlds and seek out new civilizations. If you really think about the content of season 3 so far, um, we haven't really sought out any new worlds. And so far, I don't think that we've run into too many new civilizations. Like, it seems like Rudia 4 is a pretty well known planet with a pretty well known government. The Federation has no problem sending the flagship of the fleet to restock with medical supplies. Um, there's been episodes where the crew of the Enterprise is helping out with interstellar research, which we saw at the very beginning of this season with Dr. Paul Stubbs. We have seen them serve as liaisons for ambassadors and attaches to various dignitaries in government. We have seen Jean-Luc Picard play ambassador himself to various government entities. We've also seen them serve as a military vessel along the neutral zone against the Romulans and also mediate things with the Klingons. Um, why are they there is a very good question because it seems to me if you have the flagship of your navy, which it seems the Federation has Starfleet, and Starfleet's the Navy. Um, but it's not the Navy because they have this mission of exploration. Um, I know I'm saying a lot, folks, and I'm sorry about that. But pinning down what their actual mission is has become harder and harder as these episodes go on.
Hmm.
Why they're there and not some other ship is beyond me. I don't know how to answer this. Why do you think they're there?
I think that just
So,
listening to what you're saying is it just provides the basis for the story that they came up with. Oh well, let's have a planet that has a somewhat a government that's had to become sort of semi-authoritarian because of a terrorist threat, and let's use that as the
well,
main
one
storyline, and then we'll have the Enterprise show up, and we'll make well. What's the reason they're going to show up? Well, they can bring medical supplies, but as you said, they could have a cargo ship take the medical supplies there.
well, last episode for the Hunted, they were going to Agosia 3. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
Agosia 3, and that government was trying to get into the Federation. And from the outset, they didn't seem to be an authoritarian power until one of their veterans broke out of the penal colony on Luna 5. Um, it seems to me that the Federation is often rubbing elbows and trading with other governments that either are authoritarian outright in nature, because the idea that like the Federation doesn't know that that there is a rebellion on the Western continent against the Eastern continent is just kind of unbelievable to me. Um,
Well, I
and then
think
at the same, sorry, go on.
no, I
But
think
like, there's just a lot of rubbing. Like, the Federation rubs elbows with a lot of authoritarians.
yeah,
It seems.
and see, yes, and this whole scenario, perhaps there's a weakness in the story because at one
Mm.
point, there's mention that the Insata rebellion is only 200 members. So I'm thinking if it's that small, what's the beef? I mean, if there's a Western continent, an Eastern continent, it could be like, old Pakistan, West Pakistan, and East Pakistan, that
Hmm.
one was being treated as the the stepchild, and so on. And but I think one of the weaknesses of the story, and I don't know how they would fix this because it would be probably too much explanation as to
Right.
what were the grievances that the Insata really have. That doesn't become clear. That's never
Well,
that's never pointed out.
I think that that's also a very valid point to make when it comes to a lot of the episodes that we see in this iteration of Star Trek in general. For example, even the last episode, The Hunted, and I know I'm going back to that a second time now, but um, I forget what their war was called, the Vincian or Varsian War or something. Um, but the Argosians had gone through a war, and we had no we had no context or background to that in terms of how they got to the point of developing those super soldiers. So the one of the constant weaknesses I think that you're seeing and I'm seeing too is that a lot of these episodes don't really have the context needed to really define who's bad and who's good. I think during the storyline those things are just kind of defined for themselves.
Right. And when you have a television show that's only 44, 45 minutes, that's the best you can do, probably.
Correct. And I also think I think that well, we'll get back. Let's get back into the episode a little bit, just to help get to where we're going. So, there's really two characters here that get interacted with on a pretty central basis. The first one is Kirill Finn, the Inzada leader, who is connected to Beverly Crusher since he kidnapped her. The other one is Alexandra Devos, who's the routine security chief that works directly with Commander Riker to figure out where Beverly Crusher is and how they can get her back. So, um, Devos originally requests access to Federation weapons, which Picard denies her in line with the Prime Directive. One thing that is kind of apparent here is that the routines have this really strong police state, and you made the note about are the citizenry living under fear? Like, I think you made is it has led Rutia to it has led Rutia to being under a strong police state with a citizen under constant fear, a reminder of terrorism in Israel. So I wanted to get to this point about like how people sometimes set up stories and how political stories are set up in fantasy and science fiction. In a novel or even a novella, you have a chance to kind of build a frame, but as you mentioned, you only have 45 minutes. So the writers of Star Trek have to do this in kind of like 5 to 6 act segments. So they only have so much time to world build. Um One of the things that I think the episode establishes is that there is this central government on Rutia 4 that is on the eastern continent, which is represented by Devo or Devos. I forget how her name's pronounced. But their main beef is that the Ensada terrorists are bombing cafes. They are sending children to commit acts of terror, and they are also using a technology that it has been made illegal. So one thing that's happening, I wanted to ask you if it's happening in '89 because one thing that I grew up with, I think around '91 or '92, um, and it may have been as late as '93. I don't know. Uh, I remember the first time I had any political consciousness about Israel and Palestine. The big story was that the Palestinian Liberation Organization under Yasser Arafat was negotiating with the Israeli central government, which I think at the time was Itzhak Rabin before Itzhak Rabin got
Mm-hmm.
assassinated. Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but anyway, tensions kicked up in Israel and Palestine over the situation in the West Bank and Gaza. And because of this, certain elements of the Palestinian community, fueled by Hamas and Lebanese terrorist organizations, started firing rockets, but they also started doing the insidious thing of strapping bombs to people and having people run into stores, malls, cafes. But the really scary one was bus bombings that occurred on a pretty frequent basis at one point. And I think what this episode does try to do in a way is speak to, at the time, maybe a perception of how people felt when it came to the situation in Israel, how people were feeling in general when it came to terrorism. Because, you know, I think in '89, is Reagan still in office?
80, let's
Or is
see,
this Bush? Or is
89,
this the first
January of
Bush?
89 would have been the Bush 41. Yeah.
But there's still kind of this lingering problem with terrorism. And then in 1993, Al Qaeda will bomb the World Trade Center. So I'm just ask. I just wanted to ask from your perspective. In 1989, what did terrorism look like from your perspective versus what it looks like maybe from my perspective, especially for me being the generation that experienced 9/11. I'm just curious what before 9/11, if you can remember, and going back to January '89, what was your view of terrorism? What do you think the general view of it was?
There was no concern in this country, but it was something that was a European and Middle Eastern issue.
Right.
Obviously, it was a concern in Israel because of the tension between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And, it really went back. You could go say that went back uh, to 1972 when, a group broke into the living quarters where the Israeli athletes were, and a number of them were killed, along with some of the terrorists that carried out the attack. And then there were a number of airplane hijackings by Palestinian groups and so forth throughout the, I guess in the 70s into the 80s. And, um, as you say, I think that it was before Israel put up that big protective wall between former
Hmm.
Israeli territory and West Bank territories, because there were, Palestinian Arabs that were coming into Israel allowed to work, but they would come in and they would have, bombs strapped to them and so forth. I remember this was 5 years after '89, but the first time I went to Israel, I was on the street right near the Tel Aviv beach where the American embassy was, crossing the street, and having stayed at the Dan Hotel, a very nice hotel that's right up the street from the embassy. And it was right at the spot where just a couple months before there was a bus bombing. And I remember one of the Israelis told me that because of Jewish law, rabbis and so forth went on the roofs of every building to find every piece of human flesh so that it could be, according to
Yeah.
Jewish law, buried in the, buried, processed in the proper way. I remember crossing the street. I was in the middle of the street on sort of a lane separator, and I was in the middle of two buses passing. I thought, boy, if both of these buses had bombs on them right now, there would be nothing left of me.
Yeah. I remember consciously the news talking about the bus bombings in such stark detail. And I remember also, like, there was a lot of concern about how young a lot of the Palestinian bombers were. Some of them teenagers, and not only just young men, but young women as well. Um, you know, it's funny that you mentioned the hijackings, because I grew up with the bus bombings in my consciousness, and we actually were kind of talking about them in school in our history classes a little bit, but we never talked about the plane hijackings. And I was wondering if Iran fit anywhere into this in 1989, because I know with like Jimmy Carter and Reagan, they had the no, there was the downfall of the Shah and the rise of the Ayatollahs, but then there was also the Iranian hostage crisis
Yeah,
right at the end of the Carter
that was back in
administration.
79 into 80. Yeah.
Yeah, so like, had Americans already started to develop this kind of, Reagan had this very, we don't negotiate with terrorists. Um, what was the general, like, I guess what I'm trying to figure out what I want to ask, and I'm trying to get it pointed to a place. You said there was no fear in America of terrorism,
I mean,
but when it came,
the only thing we had to deal with, there were, some people for various reasons wanted to go to Cuba. So they would hijack planes and they'd fly it into Havana, and then, they'd get the guy off, and the Cuban police would take him away, and God knows what happened to them. And the plane would fly back. But, no one was ever hurt or injured as I recall. There were
yeah,
no, tragic incidents with that. So it was all pretty much away from us until, as you said, really, um, uh, the 93 World Trade Center bombing. And then don't remember what year it was, must have been the late 90s that you had the Oklahoma City bombing, which was the first,
oh right,
the Timothy McVeigh, which was really,
right,
domestic terrorism. So
hmm,
it was really, it was back in '89. It was something. Well, it's not a problem here, but boy, that's bad when that happens in Europe or that happens in the Middle East. And then
okay,
from then, it started to really, in a think about it, it really grew and metastasized. So that
hmm,
um, 8 years later, you've got 9/11, and then um, you've got all kinds of, once our military was in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Muslim terrorism in terms of IEDs and suicide bombers and so forth were just all over the place.
Well, I think that we've all forgotten in the constant news cycles just in the last 10 years how many times Europe has been hit by terrorist
Right,
attacks.
right.
Um, I think one thing that I'm trying to also ask here, and it's kind of indelicate to ask for some of our listeners, but I need to. I need to. Um, what was your view of the Israel Palestinian crisis in general in the wake of these bombings? Like, how did you and how do you think most Americans viewed the Palestinians using these kind of means to protest their at the time I don't think a lot of people were looking at Israel as they do now as somewhat of an apartheid state. And for our Jewish listeners, I know some people will find that offensive, but there is this kind of concern on the Palestinian side and on the side of critics of Israel that the Palestinians are living in what is essentially apartheid.
I think back then in the 70s, 80s, if there was any terrorist activity against Israel, that the vast majority of Americans just disdained those acts and were very supportive of Israel.
I asked that because I said earlier that one thing that the episode I think fails in is at the end of the episode in terms of how things are resolved. Um, at least from a 2021 perspective. But let's get back into the episode a little bit. Thank you for answering that. So we ultimately what is going to happen is that Beverly's kidnapped, and one of the main concerns that Jean-Luc Picard has is how are we going to deal with Wesley Crusher? So instead of putting Wesley on the away team to help Riker go and find his mother, he assigns him to Geordi LaForge, who, uh, along with Wesley and Data, ingeniously figure out that the technology used to transport the Insata is an inverter that causes major genetic damage, and using their sensors detect some strange nuclear vibration that Wesley brings up using the Elway theorem, which is supposed to describe interdimensional travel. I looked this up. There's
Hmm.
no Elway theorem. It's
Okay.
just bogus science. For some reason, I thought it was John Elway, but it's
That's
not.
immediately what I thought. It says, what does this have to do with quarterbacking? Exactly.
Um, I do have to say I do like the idea that like they had someone was playing with interdimensional technology and it's just not something we can do
Hmm.
because if there's from what I know of dimensions, we're currently living on a third dimension, but I think if you bent your body through those things it would probably be very bad.
Hmm.
um but one thing that happens is that Finn starts Finn starts making a lot of these arguments about what's going on and why he's doing what he's doing. And the first thing he does is explain that basically uh, the Insada are fighting for their freedom and they kidnapped her because they needed a doctor. But then he asks her, why is the Federation bringing the routines, medical supplies? Why are they basically helping this government against these people that are why is your organization helping our oppressors? And it's very clear that like there is there's very much this kind of I'm trying to find the exact argument because he makes one that involves um
Yeah, I think
Washington.
that what you're looking for is that he compares their struggle to knowing enough about Earth history, and that Beverly's from the North American continent. She talks about the American Revolution and kind of compares himself to George
Right. Oh, I found the lines right
Washington.
here.
Yeah, go ahead.
May I? So during the argument, Finn says this when Dr. Crusher kept keeps saying, like, you're killing innocent people. And Finn ultimately says, this is a war for independence, and I am no better or different than your own George Washington. Dr. Crusher responds, Washington was a military general, not a terrorist. And Finn responds, the difference between generals and terrorists is only the difference between winners and losers. If you win, you are called a general. If you lose, you are killing innocent people, Dr. Crusher finishes for him. Okay, so now we're going to get into the real crux of the episode. Finn is right. I think you would agree, right? If George Washington hadn't defeated the British, he would have been hung as a traitor and ultimately would have been a footnote in history as a terrorist.
The winners write the history.
Yes. So, um,
The winners write the history that is predominantly accepted.
so what do you think of people, especially people that resort to violent means to further their political aims, using this argument? Because this is often the argument that is used by characters like this, both in narration but also in the real world. Of, like, you'll all make the argument that we're doing something evil and violent, but when later on, when you're all free, you'll all look back and you'll say, like, oh, I was a hero, I was a general, but if I had failed, I would have been called a terrorist. um what do you think of that argument when characters like Finn or anyone makes this sort of assertion in relation to their terroristic actions?
Yeah, this is why this is a really good episode, because there
Hmm.
was something you posted on Facebook a day ago that Star Trek: The Next Generation is really a philosophical story, and
Yeah.
this is really where it comes into it, because I was trying to think that not justifying the Palestinians, but when you
Mm.
get the the conflicts now that occur between Israel and the Palestinians is a lot of it more in Gaza, it seems, because Gaza is just, in some ways, a big concentration camp. And, you know,
Hmm.
when people get frustrated and they have no work and they don't have access to medical care and education and their economies for shit and so forth.
Well, I wouldn't call it a concentration camp. I would more call it a ghetto. Like, they're being ghettoized.
Yeah, and it's a really tough
Yeah.
spot. And they and I say concentration camp only because they're kind of fenced in. Yeah,
Right. Okay.
concentration camp is too strong of a term, but you can get people's level of frustration so high that they will act out to try to change
Absolutely.
the situation. I think there was probably similar things that would happen in South Africa during the apartheid period.
Hmm.
So when you look at, and this is where we've talked before about, you know, history isn't history until it's history. The
Right.
longer time span from an event, the perspective of it can change. So if there was a certain amount of terrorism uh, from colored black South Africans against the white ruling class, and if
The
it was
Afrikaners.
probably looked at upon as being a bad thing. But now, if you look back and say, well, apartheid was really not a good thing, and it's accepted that it wasn't, does
Hmm.
that in any way justify the terroristic violence? Um, and I mean, the other thing in terms of redefining
Well,
history.
but if I may stop you, because I
Yeah,
think
go
you
ahead.
you brought in a really good point, because later on, Data and Picard will actually be having a
Mm.
discussion about the actions of the terrorists, which they both uh, find to be unacceptable. Um, I think it will be Data who asks this, but let me see.
Picard, as you're looking, Picard doesn't justify it, but he
No.
sort of explains to Data the reason as to why people would choose to take that route.
Well, he also says early on in the episode, history has shown us that strength may be useless when faced with terrorism. When relating the immediate effects of Crusher's kidnapping to Troy as they're trying to figure out how to deal with Crusher. But one thing that Data says later on is, but if that is so, Captain, why are their methods often so successful? I've been reviewing the history of armed rebellion, and it appears that terrorism is an effective way to promote political change. Yes, it can be, said Picard, but I've never subscribed to the idea that political powers flows from the barrel of a gun. But then Data says, yet there are numerous examples when it was successful. The independence of the Mexican state from Spain. This one is always interesting to me. The Irish unification of 2024.
Hmm.
3 years
Hmm.
away, kids. And
Hmm.
then the Kinsey Rebellion. Yes, I am aware of them, says Picard. Then, Data says, Data asks, would it be accurate to say that terrorism is acceptable when all options for peaceful settlement have been foreclosed? Data, these are questions that mankind have been struggling with throughout history. Your confusion is only human. Um, first of all, I think the brilliance of this episode is that it kind of deals with some of the big philosophical questions that are here, and I think that it actually brings us to the edge, so we don't have to ask these again. So we won't. But in general, I after everything that's happened with Iraq and Afghanistan in my lifetime and everything post 9/11, um I fall more on the line that, like, I agree with Picard. I don't think political power and political change should be done through violence. However, living in a realistic world, um I still to this day don't know how we will ever deal with people choosing not. I don't get how at some point we take terrorism off the table, considering how effective it is. And I think it's always going to be effective. And I think the further we get technologically, the more terrorism is going to change and become more effective in a way, especially when it starts going online. Because, like, I think the last episode I talked about how I have seen videos of women and children being run down in Africa by men with machetes. That's terrifying. Um, and that's terrorism too. Like, that's physical terrorism. Uh, in the future, what if someone decided to shut down the entire power grid of a state or a seaboard, or decided to shut down the entire internet, or mess with all of the traffic lights all at once and, like, destabilize traffic patterns, or air flight patterns? Terrorism, I think, can actually become more and more dangerous and more of a problem as we go into this digitizing, advanced age. But Dad, I have to say, I just don't know how I don't know how you ever really take it off of the table as an option.
My thoughts on this, I was thinking about it just in terms of our political situation in this country, where you've got people on the far left and the far right who so
Yes.
vehemently disagree with people on the other side. They absolutely hate them. And in some cases, literally, as with Representative Gomert, I think, or whatever his name is.
Oh, Louis Gohmert. Ugh.
Yeah, the guy from Texas who made the cartoon with, you know, uh, OAC and so forth. I mean,
Oh, that's Paul Gozer.
Paul Gozer, that's right. I mean,
Yeah, Louis Gohmert's still a piece of shit, but,
right,
like, it's
yeah,
Paul Gozer.
but when you have parties that far apart and, they drive, we were talking about before about there's still a silent majority in the country. Like, for
Mm-hmm.
instance, on the abortion issue, 60% of Americans are really pro choice. They don't support abortion, they want to minimize abortion. So, you've
Mm-hmm.
got that group there, but then the people that are really yelling about abortion is the ones that are believe that or posit that life begins at conception, which is debatable and all of that sort of thing. And then you've got other people on the other side who, um, are not as vehemently, but try to protect a woman's right to decide what happens with her body. But you know, one of the things that produces terrorism is when you have that political separation that's so far apart, and people can't come into the middle and talk through things. And um, that's the kind of petri dish that foments the basis for people saying, well, I'm fed up, and the only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, blow this thing up, or, you know, take that sort of desperate action.
I think it's very, I have a constant debate about this now, especially when it comes to the foundation of America. We have this story that it was improper taxation that drove us to rebel against the British, along with, a disregard for our general, at the time, our general civil rights. I won't say human rights because, we didn't do it. Even when we founded the country, we didn't do anything to solve the situation with the slaves. So it was
Mm-hmm.
more a question of civil rights. Um, at the same time, it's they were rebelling in many cases over. It was a lot of the people that were involved with the Sons of Liberty, and a lot of the people that were involved with the writing of the Declaration of Independence and ultimately the Constitution were wealthy landowners who had the political clout and social capital to foment and form a revolution that they were able to arm and staff and ultimately fight. Because we have to remember, for the most part, the American Revolution was not popular among the colonists while it was taking
The
place.
colonists were
Um,
very, very split, almost down the middle.
absolutely. Um, so, the question of, who writes the history, but also what is an effective political movement versus or effective political action if it involves violence. And the difficulty of all these questions is that I think that we are living with this idea, and maybe Picard is trying to impress this, and maybe the writers through Picard are trying to impress this possible future, but in the future, either we have to evolve to the place where we as human beings look at the idea of political violence as completely abhorrent, or we have to, and this is going to be the really controversial thing to say, we have to accept to a certain extent that political violence is acceptable at a certain level. And I think that's a very difficult conversation to have because, one person's looting is another person's protesting. As we saw this summer or these past year with the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests, the question of like who is actually affecting actual justice through physical action is a very muddy one. So, like, where do you think the line is for you in terms of what's the difference between terrorism and, I guess, violent but justified political action?
It's really tough. I'm looking at my notes, and that after Alexandra Davos kills Finn and makes him a martyr, she says she's done that,
Right.
and she makes a statement that, well, it's an imperfect solution for an imperfect world. She says it'll
Right.
calm things down for a while, but someone will rise up and take his place, probably. And then, of course, um, the young boy has a weapon trained on Picard, and since Beverly had worked with him, she talks him down from further violence. And Riker makes a comment, says, "Well, maybe the end of all this conflict begins with one boy putting down his gun." Um, and and it goes back to the title of the. I think we need to talk about the title of the episode, "The High Ground."
Right.
Who really
So,
has the high ground here?
so
Um,
one thing that Finn wants to do, and once he figures out that the
this is an
Federation is
yeah, this is an important point because this defines
so
the high ground he's trying to get.
right. So and this is, I think, in a very interesting facet or an interesting twist, I think, in the conversation about just finding peace in general. Um, so at one point, Finn deduces that the Federation is not there to help support this government in tamping down the Insada, but they are there to provide medical supplies, and he sees this as an opportunity to get his faction into a wider intergalactic attention by ultimately trying to kidnap the captain of the Enterprise, Jean-Luc Picard, which he's successful in doing. But they also attempt to blow up the Enterprise using a charge on the warp core that Geordie LaForge daringly removes and has transported off into space, where it dramatically blows up. Blows up. It's actually a very cool sequence
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
of events.
mm-hmm.
But one thing that Finn reveals once Picard has been captured is that, and Picard says, like, you know that this is going to cause a bigger problem. People are going to come for you now, right? And Finn's like, I hope they do, because once the Federation is at the table, they're going to have to listen to us if they want to get you back, because you're our hostages, which means they're going to have to help mediate things between us and the central government on the eastern continent. And by that way, he somehow, removes the element of, like, the Insada having to fight, because the Federation is there to suddenly mediate. And that way, through forcing this mediation, he achieves a higher ground. Um, I find this fascinating. And I find Finn's idea behind this fascinating, because he goes from political. Well, he goes from violent Che Guevara political guerrilla to kind of this daring, calculating, let's gamble with fate and see if I can kind of trick everyone to the table of peace. Um, I don't think Finn ever gets the higher ground, just because he is so centered on the idea that it's either my way of the highway, and if I'm not getting what I want, people are going to die. To
Yes.
the point where he basically says, like, if I don't get what I want, I'm going to murder Jean-Luc Picard, and he says that to Beverly
Mm-hmm.
before he weirdly reveals how infatuated he is with her.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
which leads to the scene where Beverly's about to tell Jean-Luc Picard how much she loves him before they're rescued by Worf and Riker.
Right.
Um, which, by the way, that is the most daring rescue without phaser fire I have ever seen.
Yes. Yes.
Um, they just Worf and Riker literally walk in there and, like, John Wayne punch people to death.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty hilarious. But the question, does Finn ever get the higher ground, is obviously no. And this is where I kind of wanted to get to the end of the episode, because in 2021, I think in 1989 there was no higher ground to find between places like Israel and Palestine, or Pakistan and India, or even China or Taiwan, or China and Japan, or even between us and Russia, even though our relations with them were simmering. Um, I think the idea of having a third party come in, like a UN or a federation, and having them come in with this idea that they're going to force mediate is, on one hand, in 2021, we talk about how we need to end the effects of imperialism, but isn't that imperialism by definition? And it's also forcing, like, the basically what Finn wants this federation to do is, like, do away with the Prime Directive and make definite changes to these people's cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he has a lot of impossible asks, but the idea of a third party kind of arbitrating these things is very much akin to our UN. And one of the things of the Palestinians, I have to make a point of this because um, even though I am a supporter of the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, I also think that the Palestinians were there too. And I think the Palestinians deserve to have their own state. I am still a supporter of the two state solution, just for anyone at home who's wondering. Um, as a supporter of the two state solution, I've always thought that, like, one thing that the Palestinians should have is recognition at the UN, and they got that a few years ago. Um, but even then, even with having recognition at the UN, their general, like, material outcome has not really improved. So, this entire idea that Finn has that this higher ground organization like the Federation is going to come in and suddenly mediate seems not only foolish in 1989, but it seems even more naive in 2001. I'm sorry, 2000. I'm sorry,
Mm-hmm.
2021.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what do you think of this? Like, his idea of this higher ground and maybe, I don't know, kind of forcing the Federation's hand to force his people to make this huge cultural shift. What was your general thought of it? Because I just found it a very interesting but strange idea.
I think it was had some logic to it, but as you say, I don't think it was a realistic. I don't think it was realistic in terms of, you know, this Rudy Fort is not a member of the Federation. There would be prime directive issues. Yeah, there would be issues if the Enterprise were destroyed, but you know, that's almost like a whole nother episode. If the Enterprise was destroyed, what would the Federation actually do?
Well, I have to say, if the Enterprise were destroyed, like, the Insadas are not suddenly going to get, like, a seat at the table. They're going to
No,
be hunted down way harder than they were
no.
before.
Yes.
Like, they would have killed 1,100 people to, like,
Right. Right.
force people to the table of peace.
Yeah. That's yeah.
It just doesn't really make a terrible sense. But okay, what do you think the option is here in 2021? And I know I'm probably speaking for both, asking us both questions way above our pay grade.
Mhm.
Um, but from what you've observed of the world, what you've read of history, and what you've just read of the world in general, what do you think we're missing from these kind of conversations? Like, do we need a UN that has more power? Does there need to be a third party? Like, we have a world court system, but it doesn't seem like the world courts have really much effect in terms of, solving any of these international disputes. Sometimes it feels like, I guess, a conflict of arms is inevitable. And, like, in general, it seems like the Federation would want to stay out of this once they were made aware of what this is.
It's I don't know how there are situations where the blue helmets of the UN peacekeeper forces have gone in. And in some cases, they've been effective. In some cases, they aren't. There's an article coming out in The Economist that I haven't read yet, how they're trying to keep peace between terrorist groups, Islamic terrorist groups in Mali. And, the UN troops that are there are thought to be not being very effective. I think the French have some troops in Central Africa that coordinate with, the U.S. troops are in Africa to try to tamp down on terrorism and so on. And it just
Mm-hmm.
seems like everything is geopolitical based. Like,
Mm-hmm.
with China really wanting to, at some point, reunify, quote unquote, with Taiwan, are they're really working to take
Yeah, those are big quotes.
higher ground in terms of strengthening their military, having hypersonic missiles,
Mm-hmm.
things of that sort. The other shift you see is all of the political relationships that constantly shift in the Middle East. Um, you know, During the Trump administration, he pulled the accord with Iran to slow them down or try to prevent them from nuclearizing, becoming a nuclear power. Now, the Biden administration is, kind of tooling around with the idea of talking to them. And
I wanted to bring that up for a second, just
yeah,
because I have another quote that I wanted to throw at you directly about that.
sure.
One thing that Finn says to Picard when they're having well, two things. The first one, getting back to the higher ground, he says, "Captain, I am fighting the only war I can against an intractable enemy. Now I'm fighting a bigger war against a more powerful adversary. Can't
Mm.
you see how that helps me? I'm afraid I can't," says the captain. He's added another chair to the negotiating table. Oh, I'm sorry. Beverly says, "I'm afraid I can't." And then Picard says he's added another chair to the negotiating table. And Finn says, "You've added that chair, Captain. Merely forcing you to sit in it." And this is following another comment that Finn makes. And this is where I wanted to kind of go. Um, Captain, there's a lot to admire in the Federation, but there's a hint of moral cowardice in your dealings with non aligned planets. You do business with a government that's crushing us. And then you say you aren't involved. You're very much involved. You just don't want to get dirty. And it's later revealed that the government of Rutia had detained Finn's son, who was 13, and that Finn's son died in confinement. But this this kind of this kind of argument gets made a lot when it comes to America's dealings with terrorists or the West dealings with terrorists in general. Like we kind of create a lot of the terrorism in the world by associating with governments that are usually authoritarian, are usually brutal in their treatment of their native citizenry.
Well,
Um,
I just thought of where this applies, and it really applies to the time frame of when this episode took place. Is
right.
everything that happened during the Reagan administration in Central America?
Right, with the Contras and the Sandinistas.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Can you actually can you give a little bit of a background of what that is, real quick?
Well, what was going on in Central America? There was a lot of, the Central American countries had evolved so that there were a number of very wealthy landowners that
Mm-hmm.
basically, controlled everything politically and economically, and they kept everybody in, a level of serfdom almost, which provided a environment where um, people that have socialist and even communist leanings would come in. A lot of this was Soviet backed and
Mm-hmm.
uh, Cuban backed to try to, foment a socialist revolution in those countries and so forth. And
An expansion of the Warsaw Pact, essentially.
Nicaragua was probably the best example with the
Mm-hmm.
Sandinistas, of which Daniel Ortega was the leader, who's now the authoritarian president of Nicaragua. It's kind of like a
Yeah.
complete shift in role. But as I said in an email to you, if you go far to the left and far to the right, they circle around, and totalitarianism is totalitarianism,
Yeah,
regardless of
exactly.
whether you're a communist or a Nazi. So what happened is that, one of the controversies of the Reagan administration is they, after, all of the problems with the Iranian hostage uh, uh, crisis, we were actually we couldn't arm, the rebel groups in Central America, but we could pay through the CIA Iran to send weapons in. And this was done without congressional approval. It was uh, uh, against U.S. law and so forth. And it really could have ended up Reagan being impeached, but he kind of danced through it and so forth. And
Oh, he slipped his way through it.
one of the Tom Clancy movies, Clear and Present Danger, is sort of a parody of that whole event.
Right. Well, I think I think getting to what you just said in terms of the geopolitical aspect of kind of dealing with. I'm sorry. I had the thought in my head because you had a really good point, and I had the thought in my head. I just lost it. It's a little late, but um, let me try to find that again. Daniel Ortega. Um, you made the point about it doesn't matter if you go right or left. It doesn't matter if it's a Nazi or a communist. At some point, you get to totalitarianism. One of my earlier questions is like, it seems that the Federation deals with a lot of totalitarian governments, and that they knowingly rub elbows with these people and are often shocked to discover that these people are taking part in these kind of political regimes over their people. One thing that I think, and I have the one thing that I find really interesting about this episode is Finn's point to Picard: you do business with a government that's crushing us, and then you say you aren't involved. How much do you think um, our complicity, how much do you think Western complicity plays into the actual creation and execution of terrorism in the world? Do you think that we are directly responsible for things like the impetus behind 9/11, or do you think that those things were coming for us anyway?
Oh, I think that when you go back to the Central American situation, we definitely fomented that, and
Yes.
we're bearing the bitter fruit of the immigration problem on the border. You know, from those
Right.
those countries never developing economically and people being very poor and destitute and so on. I think when you go to the terrorism for radical Islam, I don't see that as being justifiable at all. I think those
Yeah.
people are just plain nuts, and I think they're
Well,
you know
I think to add some context to it, a lot of these terrorists in the Middle East are following a philosophical form of Islam called Wahhabism, which is only practiced by 10% of most Muslims in the Middle East. But when you have a religion of 2 billion people, 10% is a large number of people to
and and
believe
there,
in some
and
very extreme things.
there's a related philosophy that I don't totally understand the difference called Salafism also.
Yes, yes. Well, Salafism has Salafism removes some of the things from Wahhabism in terms of um. So okay, kind of going into this really quickly without going down the rabbit hole. Wahhabism has a deeply spiritual aspect. Like Wahhabism is where you get the 72 virgins, where if you commit these terrorist acts, if you strap on a bomb and go into a bus, like you're gonna have 72 virgins serving you in your private heavenly harem in the afterlife. Wahhabism has some very potent ideas about like rewarding your warriors for their duty and stuff like that. Um, the other one is more based on certain communal parts of Islam really dating to like um, the Sunni faith, and has more to do with the idea that like these lands are ours. These are Muslim lands. These are our holy lands, and we're going to keep you off of them. It has Wahhabism has less to do with like okay, a lot of terrorists in Saudi Arabia want the Americans out, want American bases out of Saudi Arabia, not because they think like oh they're exerting influence on us, but because we are besmirching their holy lands.
Hmm.
There's none of this like oh we need to kill these people because we're going to get to a better heaven. It's like no, this is literally sacred ground, and every time you infidels step on here, you're besmirching the most important place on earth. Um, it's two very one is a eschatological viewpoint. The one is very materialistic and actually very territorial in a way.
Okay.
But sorry,
Right.
that was a little bit of a
Yeah. Okay.
dovetail.
That's good. Right.
Um, I think one thing that like Finn really kind of fails to grasp in all this is that once the violence starts, there really is no stopping it. And even, you brought up the very last scene where he tries to kill Picard once the raid on the Insada begins, and it's a joint raid between the Federation and the Routian security forces.
Hmm.
Which, by the way, very anticlimactic raid. Um, for 200 rebels, they really kind of like take them down very quickly with minimal resistance. But Riker and DeVos have this conversation after the youngest Ansata boy decides not to shoot Picard. Maybe the end of all this is a young boy putting down his rifle, but I am not sure that that is the answer either. It's very clear that Rutia 4 has like a truly oppressive government going on, and like whatever the problem is that caused these Asada rebels to rise up in the first place isn't going to immediately go away.
No.
Um, and this is going to be the last question I ask you, Dad, before we go. And I know that we've dealt with a lot of heavy things tonight, and it's been a good episode. And I think overall that this is a good episode. But and this will be my final statement, and I'll leave you with the final question, and we'll end it there.
Okay.
So in 2021, I think the end of this episode fails because it doesn't deal with the fact that um, even though Finn's dead, uh, you still have a dead martyr on your hands. And someone makes the comment earlier on in the episode, one dead martyr is worth 10. I think the statement is a dead martyr is worth 10 posturing leaders.
Hmm.
Once Finn's dead, there is no reason to think that, like, the leadership isn't going to keep posturing their way through the problem. So I'm leaving you with this. Uh, if you had to really solve the issue of Rutia 4, or if you had to solve terrorism in general, what do you think needs to be done that isn't being done now? I think it's obvious that like we have a problem with leadership, but I think another one is just the clear communication gap between people. Like I don't think people in Afghanistan know who we are, but I think if they did, they would feel a lot less likely to kill us. What do you think?
Mm. Um, I think it is, if you look at the situations from which terrorism sprouts, it's because, as we've kind of said, people are so frustrated they don't see any other way. So it does get into whatever government bodies exist, they have to provide good leadership. They have to listen. They have to work with other parties who might be stakeholders. For instance, again, the example of Central America, they're our
Mm-hmm.
neighbors. We're not ever going to solve the immigration problem. Um, I don't even know if you do it if you really did put up a 20-foot wall, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific until can change how people live in those countries. And,
Mm-hmm.
there's geographical and climatological issues that are coming up now that
Mm-hmm.
aren't easy to solve. And they're going to get worse because of some of the immigration that's happened the last 2 years is because some of the hurricanes have gone through there and devastated croplands and caused flooding and mudslides and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. And those governments don't have a FEMA as anywhere near effective of ours.
Correct. Well, like one thing, we all one thing that's often lost in the news now, the civil strife in Syria or the civil war in Syria was actually brought about because of a drought.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, you're absolutely right that I think leaders need to take far more responsibility, but also not only in listening, but also assessing and assuaging the actual material concerns of the people that they serve, in ways that matter. Dad, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I think I think the high ground is a very good episode, and I think you and I would agree that it's an enjoyable one. Um, we will be back next time. I think for an episode is just pure fun. We'll be reviewing Star Trek: The Next Generation, season 3, episode 13, Deja Q. Dad, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jay. It was
Joining
fun.
me, but
It was fun.
yeah. Well, we're gonna have more fun next time. See you soon.
Okay. All right. Bye bye.
Bye.